Licensed games in the 80s and 90s had a reputation. They could be terrible, mediocre, and every once in a while, surprisingly good. But most of them stuck to formulas players already knew. After all, why fix something that isn't broken? But today, I want to talk about the licensed games that dared to do something different. Instead of giving players exactly what they expected, they took their licenses in completely unexpected directions. Sometimes the results were brilliant. Sometimes they were just plain weird. Let's take a look at some of the most unusual licensed games ever made. Batman games on PC have always been a bit hit or miss. Batman Returns isn't exactly a masterpiece, but it does try something different. Instead of another straightforward action game, it turns Batman into a real detective. You have a limited number of days to save Gotham City from the Penguin, using Batman's gadgets and the Batmobile. You'll fight various enemies to extract information that helps advance your investigation, while exploring locations like the Plaza and the Mayor's office in search of clues. Combat is mostly automatic, with your only real input being Batman's gadgets like the Batarang. Unfortunately, that makes the fights feel repetitive, especially since you'll face the same 3 or so enemy types over and over again. The bigger problem is that, despite having a point-and-click interface, the game is surprisingly restrictive. There are no real characters to question, and the game gives you almost no hints about what you're supposed to do next, or even whether you've done everything you can that day, at least until you've made a bit of progress. Back in the day, the game was visually impressive, presenting its story through digitized cinematic sequences that tried to imitate the movie. Today, I'd only recommend it to the most dedicated Batman fans. If you're looking for a Batman game with a stronger focus on detective work and storytelling, you're much better off playing the Telltale games. Dune 2 is widely considered one of the games that defined the modern real-time strategy genre. While the original Dune was more of a hybrid adventure and strategy game, the sequel became something entirely different. The game follows the brutal war between House Atreides, House Harkonnen, and House Ordos as they fight for control of the spice. Each faction has its own campaign, unique units, and special weapons. If you've ever played an RTS before, you'll be surprised by just how familiar everything feels, despite the game being more than 30 years old. You build a base, gather resources using harvester vehicles, expand your army, defend your territory, explore a map hidden by the fog of war, and eventually destroy the enemy's base. The core formula that countless strategy games would later build upon is already here. Everything from harvesting spice to fighting over the desert feels like a natural extension of the Dune universe, making Dune 2 far more than just another licensed game. It also helped define a genre that would inspire countless strategy games for decades to come. What's even harder to believe is that the entire game fit on just 4 floppy disks, complete with mission briefings, cutscenes, and digitized voice transmissions over the radio. Westwood pushed themselves even further by creating a Sega Genesis version, perhaps as a nod to Herzog's Y, one of the games that helped inspire Dune 2 in the first place. That makes Dune 2 not only one of the most unique licensed games ever made, but also one of the most influential video games in history. Spider-Man games are almost as old as the video game industry itself, and most titles from the 80s and 90s were either beat-em-ups or platformers. The Amazing Spider-Man from 1990 doesn't completely abandon that formula. At first glance, it looks like a fairly standard platformer, but take a closer look and you'll find that it's much more focused on puzzles. Spider-Man can't simply punch his way through every enemy. Instead, he has to slow them down with his webbing or outsmart them as he makes his way to rescue Mary Jane from Mysterio's illusion-filled studio. Unlike modern Spider-Man games, you can't control your webs once you've fired them. It takes some practice to master swinging, especially when shooting diagonally to send Spidey flying through the air. At first, you'll probably play it safe and stick to straight web shots, but as you get more comfortable, you'll gradually improve your technique, and that's a big part of what makes discovering this game for the first time so rewarding. The difficulty, however, is a different story, and not always for the right reasons. There are very few places where you can restore your health, and Spidey doesn't have any invincibility frames. That means, if you get tangled in your own web, You can lose a huge chunk of your health bar in just a few seconds. The game does include save points, but they're erased as soon as you exit to DOS. So every time you come back, you have to start over, revisit the same rooms, and flip dozens of switches all over again. In hindsight, maybe a password system would have been a better idea. The Amazing Spider-Man is very much a product of its time, for better and for worse. Even so, compared to games like The Amazing Spider-Man and Captain America in Dr. Doom's Revenge, yes, that's the real title, it's pretty clear which game holds up better.
Chex Quest is a unique game, mostly because of just how bizarre it is. Taking a well-known American breakfast cereal and turning it into a first-person shooter built on the Doom engine is one thing. Dressing the main character in a Chex suit and having him battle slime monsters, that's something else entirely. As for the game itself, I don't have that much to say. Then again, maybe I'm just a grumpy old gamer. It probably wouldn't win any awards for its level design. Most of the maps are fairly flat and feel more like Wolfenstein 3D than Ultimate Doom, even though that's the engine it's built on. That said, I have to give the developers some credit. Replacing the chainsaw with an electrified spoon and creating their own family-friendly version of the BFG was actually pretty clever, especially considering they had to redesign every weapon to look as little like a real firearm as possible. Even the ventilation shafts felt surprisingly fresh for the time. The original release included only 5 playable levels, with broken leftovers from Ultimate Doom's original 32 maps still hidden inside the files. Even so, the game ended up building a surprisingly dedicated fan community. It eventually received 2 sequels and even an HD remake. Here's one last fun fact. According to General Mills, Chex Quest was the first video game ever distributed inside cereal boxes. They produced an incredible 6 million copies in a single run.
Revolution X is one of the most recognizable arcade shooters, partly thanks to Aerosmith, and perhaps also because of its terrible home ports for the Super Nintendo and Genesis. It has found its way onto plenty of lists of weird or downright bad games, mostly because of its creepy story and quotes like, "Music is the weapon," or "Generation X is in effect." So, to give the game a fair chance, I decided to try the arcade version in the most authentic way I could. The original cabinet let you fire freely using enormous mounted machine guns, with your crosshair constantly visible on the screen. Unlike games such as Time Crisis, you do not have to reload or take cover while doing it. Because of that, playing with a mouse does not make the game ridiculously easy, so I think I succeeded. Unfortunately, that still does not save the game, which is average, at best. Most of the time, you will not even see the members of Aerosmith. Instead, you will shoot thousands of yellow New Order Nation soldiers and throw CDs at them. The music was supposed to save the game, but the arcade version only takes up around 16 megabytes. Once you include all the digitized characters, that did not leave much room for anything beyond a few seconds from each song, repeated endlessly in a loop. This is one area where the CD-based console versions, such as the PlayStation version, have a certain advantage. However, their controls and loading times make that small advantage almost irrelevant. What you are left with is a completely average game that tries to be much more than it really is. Once you realize there is not much beneath the flashy presentation and all that glam, it becomes very easy to lose interest. If you want to play a game that actually respects the history of rock and roll, I strongly recommend Brutal Legend. Pepsi Man is another bizarre license game that became surprisingly famous thanks to YouTube, despite never receiving an official Western release. Surprisingly, Pepsi Man was an actual mascot used by Pepsi in Japan. The game itself also seems to borrow a few ideas from another famous Sony mascot. I was curious to find out whether there was anything special about the game beyond its wonderfully weird Japanese charm. The good news is that it's actually a pretty solid game, especially considering its low budget. At its core, it plays a lot like Crash Bandicoot, except you're always running forward and can never stop moving. In a way, that makes it an endless runner almost a decade before smartphones made the genre explode. The less enjoyable part is the difficulty, especially during the sections where the camera moves in front of the character. If you've been looking for another Battletoad-style experience, congratulations, you found one. And that's only the third stage. Things just keep getting weirder from there. Checkpoints and continues make the game manageable if you're patient and have a good memory. On the other hand, if you're the kind of player who rage quits, this probably won't be your new favorite game. Sneak King is one of the 3 games Burger King released as part of a promotion, where you could get them with a value meal for just a few extra dollars. It's also, without a doubt, the weirdest, but easily the most creative of the bunch. The basic idea is simple. You play as the king, and your job is to surprise hungry people by sneaking up on them and handing them different kinds of Whoppers. And yes, I'll admit I'm not exactly an expert on Burger King's menu, so the stealth mechanics actually make perfect sense. What makes a little less sense are the flourish dances you perform after surprising someone. The better you do in the QTE, the more impressive the dance becomes, and the more points you earn. The game is completely self-aware, and that's honestly its biggest strength. The problem is that, underneath all the charm, the gameplay does become repetitive. Each level is basically a small sandbox, and before moving on, you'll need to complete 20 different challenges. The early ones are pretty repetitive, but they gradually become more creative, and a lot more demanding. For example, one challenge asks you to surprise only people with the highest hunger level. Another requires you to stay at the lowest flourish rank by intentionally failing the QTE. The later challenges aren't just harder because they're more demanding. They're harder because extremely hungry people eventually pass out. That means you sometimes have to run across the entire map looking for another easy target, which also increases your chances of being spotted by multiple people at once. There are also a few control issues. Moving the right stick makes the camera rotate in the opposite direction from what I'd expect, which is something you can change in almost any modern game. Sometimes people also turn around so quickly that it's difficult to react in time, even while running. Then again, maybe that's just because stealth games and I have never really gotten along, even when they're supposed to be lighthearted. To the developers' credit, they had plenty of ideas to make the game even more interesting. One of them was a capture the flag mode where players could become the king themselves. Another let players work together to stop him. According to the developers, Burger King rejected both ideas because they wanted there to be only one king. Nobody else could become him, and they certainly didn't want players beating him up. I don't know, that sounds a little Fortnite before Fortnite to me. Still, the strategy worked. Despite receiving fairly average reviews, Sneak King went on to sell at least several 100,000 copies. I hope you enjoyed the video. What licensed games surprised you with how different they were? Let me know in the comments.